This occupied almost all of volume 1, volume 8, not all, but almost at least more than half. So there's going to be a lot of material. Okay, so we're on volume 8, Tzurba M'Rabanan, Hilchos Tefillin 263. In the next series of shiurim, which will continue to the second volume, we will discuss the various halachos of tefillin, including the structure of the tefillin themselves, the procedure of how and when to wear them, and halachos related to their sanctity, their kedusha. In this shiur, we'll focus mainly on halachos pertaining to the tefillin themselves, including the batim, the black boxes, and the ritzuos. Here's a quote from Reb Chaim Palagi, who writes in Tnufas Chaim about the importance of scrupulously ensuring that one's tefillin are kosher of good quality. You can read a biography of Rav Palagi on the next page. Libi oimerli, my heart tells me, sharichos hagolus hu ba'avur ki bidoras halal. One of the reasons why our golus is so long is bavnusenu arabim, because we are sinners. In gorish ve'mavakesh al mitzvahs hanachos tefillin, we're not careful enough about the mitzvahs of tefillin. The menichin tefillin psulos b'kama minei ta'uyos. People wear posel diket tefillin because of a number of problems. V'oivrim yomim v'shanim, days and years go by. U'mavorchen brachos levatola b'chol yom. If you make a bracha and you say the name of Hashem on an unkosher pair of tefillin, you're evoking a bracha levatola. And mevatlin mitzvah say. You're not fulfilling the mitzvah say of hanachas tefillin. V'amina b'nochos daf mem dal amid beis kol sheinu meniach tefillin oiver b'ches asay. If you don't put on tefillin, you're over in 8 different assays. Now, why is the reason that a lot of people are wearing unkosher tefillin? Hasibohi shekoinin tefillin b'nei adam she'ena mumchim. They buy tefillin from people that are not expert. They don't even know that they're walking in darkness. Even a soifer who's an expert soifer can make a mistake. Someone who's not an expert professional, and doesn't know the dinim carefully. And even if he has a little bit of Yiras Shamayim, for this reason, we have a prolonged golus. That people who have not studied properly and don't have enough Yiras Hashem are prolonging the exile. They're acting like Yerava ben Nevat, who are causing people to be choyte umachti. V'im isher cheli. He says, if I could be zoicha to it, hayisim metaking, I would make a correction, a takana. Imayu maskimi malas rabam, if the chachami would agree with me, do lo yuchal shomadim lichtov sefer Torah mezuzas. Just a regular person can't just stand up and serve as a soifer. Afilu kmeyas, even making amulets. Im lo kayim godol shimusha etzel mumcha. First, he has to do an internship and a residency, an apprenticeship under an expert. And yikach smicha me'asoimchim amuvakim should be here. He should be given a smicha test in terms of writing tefillin and sifrei Torah mezuzas, and be tested by the experts of the city. Without this smicha, without this certification, he shouldn't be allowed to write one letter. Our shoichtim have certification. Our moyalim have certification. Why should a soifer be any different? So the Torah source for the mitzvah of tefillin is mentioned in a very general manner. In the following psukim, the Torah commands us to tie the tefillin on the hand and to be a sign between the eyes. It says in Parshas Shema, "Ukshartem la'osa yadecha, va'ayu l'totafos beineinecha." And then it says in Parshas Vayayim Shemoah, "V'samtem es vay'ela al vavchem nafshechem, ukshartem osam li'osa yadchem, va'ayu l'totafos beineinechem." However, the Torah doesn't specify what exactly must be tied on the arm and in between the eyes, and how the tying is performed. Chazal explain that 4 parshios that are in the Torah must be written on parchment, similar to the Sefer Torah itself, placed inside boxes known as batim. These batim are tied on the arm and the head using straps known as ritzuos. Now, there are 10 halachos l'Moshe Sinai for tefillin. Chazal comment that a number of the key halachos with regard to tefillin are classified as halach l'Moshe Sinai. Halachos transmitted orally to Moshe at Sinai that were never recorded in the written Torah. And the following Gemara Menachos Lamed Hey Amud Aleph mentions a number of them. Amrav Chanan el Amarav. Titura de tefillin. Titura is the base that we put the box on. Halach l'Moshe Sinai. Amar Abaya Mavarta de tefillin. Mavarta is the passageway that the ritzuos are connected to the batim through the mavarta. Halach l'Moshe Sinai. Amar Abaya Shin shel tefillin. The fact that our tefillin have to have a shin sticking off of it. Halach l'Moshe Sinai. Amar Yitzchak ritzuos shchoros. The fact that the straps have to be black. Halach l'Moshe Sinai. Tana tefillin merubas. The fact that tefillin have to be square. Halach l'Moshe Sinai. Amar Rav Papa b'tafran uvelachsoinan. That means the diagonal have to be perfectly square. When the batim are sewn, when the batim are placed on the titura, on the base, it's got to be perfectly square. Rashi gives us an explanation. Titura gesher. Gesher is like a bridge. Lachar shenasan ha'igros b'batim. After the parchments have been placed in the cavities of the batim, derech haper rachav, there's an opening that's wide. Shabbatim masui kein bati adayim shekoin guten. It's like a glove. You know, if you ever seen tefillin made, it's got 4 compartments. It's like a glove, and you put the compartments in. Umachtas ha'ikros derech haper. It's the 4 parchments are placed in the opening. V'nois nebati ha'etzbos. And the choitech migimel adfanis mikolachas me'ad, the adalat nishes one of the sides remains long. The koifel la'oisa oirech, and you fold it over. Umetila chudin shel gimel adfanis. The toifer chudin, you sew the sinew shel gimel adfanis al rachva. We'll see a picture of that in a minute. V'hu beis moshava shel tefillin. V'nira ke'ein daf shel gesher. It looks like a bridge. That's, if you look at the next page, the bottom is the titura, right? The bottom is the titura. See, titura is the bottom that the batim are stuck on. Mavarta is the bridge, is where you place the straps through the titura. Rashi says, "Kishnoitin haratzur shel tefillin saviv osa titura, yachpil haklaf saviv haratzua, ke'ein shoisim lefi hamechnas like pans, shlotehei haratzua kvua elek shrotzu moshcha ele." That ritzua has some give. You can move it because you can tighten it, you can open it, right? Rotzu moshcha elech ve'elech umach rosh hazeh umekatz rosh hazeh v'loshen mavarta shemavira moshechas l'chol tzad sheyirtzeh. That you can pass ritzus on either side. Hello, Saul.
How you doing?
Saul is here. Please. Shin shel tefillin. You can see the shin coming off the bias. Lebeis chitzoyna oisin kimin kmotim dakim beklaf. You make some creases on the inside of the leather, veneer and boke ain't shin. It sticks it out. So this sugya in the Gemara introduces 3 unique parts of the tefillin, in addition to the black box of the bias. The titora, which is the base of the tefillin, we're on page 266, Saul. So could you pass me?
Didn't you send something out that was 8:15 tonight?
8:15.
Did you do that?
No.
I know, you're always early.
Nothing went out.
Sorry.
266. You'll see there's a picture of tefillin there, and we're reading through the this colored box. The titur is the base of the tefillin box made out of leather. This part of the tefillin is wider than the square box of the bayit. It looks like a board. The mabarta is the place attached to the bayit of the hand and head tefillin through which the ritzuos pass through. Susie, could you pass? I don't know, is it very warm in here?
Yeah, but I thought it would be.
It's extremely warm in here. So this is the Mabarta, right? There's a space through the Ritzua's go, and you can, it's not fixed to anything. And the shin, right? The shin is engraved upon both sides of the tefillin. You'll see it's on both sides of the tefillin shel rosh, protrudes slightly from the bayit. The right side, right? If I look at my tefillin, the way it sits on my head, the right side of the tefillin has a three-headed shin. The left has a four-headed shin. Take a look at your tefillin, and you'll see that there's a difference between the shin on the right and the shin on the left, right? One is 3 and one is 4. Footnote: the reason for the three-headed shin on one side and the four-headed shin on the other is explained differently by various maforshim.
Can be moldy, can be made with a mold, or definitely by hand, or it can be made by machine, the box itself can be made.
We'll see, but it can't, remember, the shin has to be made from the inside, pushing out.
So it can be made, can you have a mold that you can put in and the machine can stamp it out? Press the leather, or does it have to be made by hand by pushing it out? Okay.
One constructs types of thin creases on the leather, which have the appearance of a shin. I don't know if that we'll see whether that can be done by a machine. We're going to get to that.
Okay.
Why do we have a three-headed shin and a four-headed shin? The Smog says that the three-headed shin corresponds to the shin of a Torah scroll, which uses a standard three-pronged shin. The four-headed shin corresponds to the shin used on the luchos, which was formed by empty space, as was seen only due to the outline formed by the remaining stone, right? The luchos were engraved through and through. So like a mem or a samech, right, floated in space. So the shin also, because of that, had 4 fingers because of the engraving, because there would be space on either side. The Gemara in Shabbos mentions a few additional aspects of the tefillin that are also classified as halacha l'Moshe Sinai, including the fact that the straps must be black and that the hair and the sinews used to fashion the batim must come from a kosher animal. The context there in the Gemara is the Gemara discussion of how to interpret a statement of Rav Yosef that the hide of a kosher animal is required for forming the parchment on which you're going to write the parshios, not the batim, but the parchment for the ksav. Elahadatani Rav Yosef. This is Masechta Shabbos Kaf Ches Amud Beis. Elahadatani Rav Yosef lo yihochsheru b'mlecha shemayim ela or b'behemet Torah bilvad. The only kind of hide that is going to be permitted if you're doing something that's going to be used for Kodesh Baruch Hu is the hide of a kosher animal. Now the Gemara doesn't know what Rav Yosef is referring to when you say Melecha Shammai, Lamai Hilchasa, L'tfilin. So the Gemara asks, what do you mean? Tfilin ba'dei ksiv buhu. We don't need Rav Yosef because it says Laman tiyeh Torah Hashem beficha, min hamoiser beficha, min hamuter beficha. What's permitted for you to put in your mouth. And so that teaches me that I don't need Rav Yosef's drasha because I already have it. Ela la'oirim. So the Gemara really means that Rav Yosef is talking about not to the parchment that you're going to write the tefillin on, that it has to be, comes from a kosher animal. Rather, it's talking about to the leather that's being made to make the batim of the tefillin. Ela lo oiron. Rabbi shouldn't show tefillin halacha l'Moshe Messinai. But we already have been told by Abaya that there's a halacha l'Moshe Messinai that the shin has to be protruding, and therefore it's going to be, it's probably similar to parchment. And we already have the drasha then that you're going to have to use the hide of a kosher animal. Allah says the Gemara, another attempt to understand what Rav Yosef is referring to, L'karchan b'sa'ar l'toy from beginning. That means we're talking about the sinews that are used and the thread used to sew the tefillin together has to be from a kosher animal. That we don't need Rav Yosef statement, his Amoraic statement, like Onri Amarav, and they say a halacha. Same thing here. Rav Yosef, Tani Rav Yosef, is an Amoraic statement. What do I need it for? If I already have it for halacha l'Moshe Sinai, where do I see that I have that din halacha l'Moshe Sinai? Tanya tefillin merubas, tefillin to be square halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Nichrachos b'sar and is supposed to begin. And another aspect of the halacha l'Moshe Sinai is that you have to tie them and sew them with the sinews. It has to be from a kosher animal. Ella says the Gemara l'ritzuos. When Rav Yosef said that lo huchsharu elo or b'hemet Torah, it's referring to the straps. The fact that they're black, and l'chora, the fact that they're going to have to come from a kosher animal. It only said black. It didn't say that they have to be tor. So that's why we needed Rav Yosef's statement that it has to come from a kosher animal. So you can see that's where they came up. There are 10 halacha l'Moshe Sinai connected to tefillin. Not all of them are in Menachos, but some are in this sugya in Masechta Shabbos. So the Gemara concludes that Rav Yosef's requirement for a kosher animal refers to the ritzuos, which must also be from the hide of a kosher animal, but are not derived from the same place where we derive that the parchment has to be from a kosher animal, because that we learn out from Lamantia Torah Hashem Beficha. They're not derived from the words in your mouth, since they are not considered actual Torah like the parchments themselves. And the ritzuos are a lesser construct than the parshios. That we can learn it's similar to Torah. But the ritzuos needed a different limud from Rav Yosef. Nevertheless, as mentioned, a number of other requirements of tefillin are mentioned within the sugi as well.
Does the leather have to be a kosher animal? Does it have to be shechted, kadas kadin, or you can take it from, let's say, an animal, a kosher animal dies. Can you use that skin, or does it have to have shechita to make it? Maybe toras beficha.
Well, an animal that dies is a nevela, and there are certain halachas what you can do with a nevela or not. You can give it to the klavim. So an animal that
the skin, but the leathers. What about the leather itself? Does that also make it a nevela? The leather's nevela. It's not kosher.
I'm saying you're only chayav. You only get a lav for eating kazayas of a nevela, of a basar nevela. The hide is not considered the meat that you would get a lav for. But a nevela animal, all parts of the nevela animal, l'chora, have tuma, and they have certain dinim in terms of are you allowed to benefit from them or not. So we'll see. Well, right now, we haven't been told whether you need it has to be properly slaughtered, or let's say even a treifa animal is properly slaughtered and it removes the tumor from it. You're not allowed to eat it, but a treifa you can benefit from. There's certain benefits from. So we'll see whether or not the leather can come from a treifa animal or not.
Okay.
That will also come as well. Good question.
Actually, I think it's discussed a little later on in the Tzurba.
Correct.
Okay.
But it's a very good and appropriate question. Very good and appropriate question.
Okay.
In total, there are 10 halachas with regard to tefillin. They're classified as halacha. Some based upon the sources we have seen, and others that are mentioned in different sources. One must write the parshas with ink, known as dio. That's in Yerushalmi, that those of us in the Daf Yomi saw it and Daf Tes. The Rambam brings it Hilchos Tefillin. Number 2, one must write the parshas on parchment. One must fashion a titorah like we discussed. One must fashion a mamabarta. The bottom of both the shel yad and shel rosh must be square. This includes the length and the width of the batim must be the same. This does not pertain to the height of the batim, which may be different than the length and width. It doesn't have to be a perfect cube. The width and the length have to be the same, but the height can be different. The titorah must be in the form of a square as well. And the stitches of the titorah must be square. Take a look at if you take a look from, I would suggest while we learn this, you have your tefillin available. If you look down on your tefillin, you'll see it, the stitching is a square. It's an exact square as well. One must fashion the form of a shin that protrudes from both sides of the tefillin shel rosh by pressing down on the hide. The shin on the right contains 3 heads. The one on the left contains 4. Before inserting the parchas in the batim, one rolls them up from end to beginning, right? Like those of us, right, when you see us rolling the Megillah, you can roll it. So you got to roll it from the end to the beginning. There's a hakpada how it's rolled. So however the parsha starts, you roll it from the end to the beginning, and wraps them in a piece of animal hair. It's customary to use the hair of a calf as a reminder of the sin of the golden calf, and as an atonement for it. You can see Orach Chaim 3244, the Mishnah Berurah there mentions that. One must sew the batim closed with stitches made from the sinews of a kosher animal, though it not be from one that underwent proper shechita. It is preferable to use an ox and customary to take from its heel. So far we've seen that the stitches made from the sinews of a kosher animal doesn't have to undergo proper shechita. According to Maimonides poskim, the batim also must be colored black in addition to the straps. There's a source, Shulchan Aruch and Mishnah Berurah. The commentary ascribed to Rashi as that this halach also includes not turning over the ritzuos where they are tied. One must fashion a knot on both the ritzu of the shel yad and the shel rosh. So you can see the picture of the kesher in the back of the tefillin shel rosh, and there's different minhagim regarding the tefillin shel yad. Some have it like a yud. We'll see whether they discuss that later. What about the halachas of the batim? Following this overview of many aspects of tefillin, we will now focus on a number of halachas of tefillin in more detail, beginning with some aspects of the batim. One of the questions dealt with by the Rishonim concerning the batim, into which the parchment with the parshas are placed, involves the leather from which they are made. The Beis Yosef cites a Gemara Menachos that discusses whether one large piece of leather is used for the batim, or whether 4 distinct pieces must be used. The Beis Yosef, who of course is the commentary on the Tur, is Rav Yosef Karo. The Perek HaKoimetz, Tanya, Koisven al arba oiros, you write the parshas on 4 different parchments. Umenichon ba'arba batim ba'or echad. You should have 1 piece of leather with 4 compartments. The Kosev b'Sefer HaTruma, one of the Rishonim that is often quoted by the Beis Yosef, Perush sheyu arba batim uchuborm yachad me'or echad. This bias has to be made from 1 piece of leather. Oh, shama me'arba oiros. Maybe it could be made from 4 distinct pieces, as long as you sew them together. V'vatshu toifim zelzeh. The tov v'nachon lasis me'or echad ad kam lashonim. So
This is only for the shel rosh. The shel yad only has 1 compartment and one parchment. It's all written on 1 parchment.
So right now we're talking about the tefillin shel rosh.
Yeah, it's only he doesn't say that, but that's clearly what it is.
Yeah, because you have four compartments there.
Right.
And there are 4 parchments placed there. The shaila is, I think though you all have seen it, they manufacture it out of 1 piece, and then like the glove analogy that Rashi said, you see these dips in this 1 piece of leather where you can put four pieces of parchment in. The Sefer HaTruma was said there's a possibility that you could take 4 pieces of leather and sew them together. He says it's better to use one piece. That's what the Tur brings from the Sefer Truma. According to the Sefer Truma, that the Beis Yosef brings, more means that either the 4 batim should come from one piece of leather, the 4 different compartments should come from one, or they may be formed from 4 pieces joined together, but the former option is preferable, that is, from one piece. The Yalkut Yosef, Ravadia Yosef, writes that this is the practical halacha today as well. The 4 batim should ideally all be fashioned from one hide, though according to the strict letter of the law, sewing 4 pieces together is also valid. You should, it's like a hidur, to get your tefillin with from one piece of leather that 4 compartments have been made, because that fulfills the din according to everybody. If let's say you had 4 different ones and you sew them all together, mahani, it'll work. And even though the batim are made from one piece of hide, but it's not like you have to the bias and that base and the mabarta, that all doesn't have to come from the same piece. If those come from a separate piece of hide, the tefillin is good, and that's the minig ha'olam. If you can find a craftsman who can make it all from one piece of leather, then that's a good thing as well. What about the size of the batim? The Gemara didn't state explicitly how large the batim have to be. The Meforshim note that the Gemara in Eruvin 95a states that there's a space on a person's head to place 2 pairs of tefillin, shel rosh, together, right? You're supposed to put it on the fontanelle. If you see a baby, so a baby has an opening in the front of his skull and in the back of his skull, the anterior and the posterior fontanelle. Our fontanelles have closed, but there is a space that's where what that is where all the skull is made up of like floating bones. They come together in that location. So that's the location of the tefillin shel rosh. And technically you could place 2 batim there. It seems that the batim then are not particularly large. On the other hand, it seems that they're not particularly small either, because according to Gemara, there's a limit. Only 2 batim fit on the head and not 3. So the Shulchan Aruch writes that according to halacha, there's no minimum measurement existing for the size of the batim, though the Mishnah Berurah adds that ideally the minimum size should be 2 etzbos by 2 etzbos, 2 finger breadth, which is approximately 4 by 4 centimeters. That's the minimum size. He warns that if you have batim that are smaller than that, the parshios inside small tefillin are often of inferior quality due to the small size, and you should avoid it. So let's see, the Shulchan Aruch Chaim Lamed Beis says, Orech v'rochav habatim v'goyveim ein lo shir. He says the height, the width, the length, the width, and its height, there's no minimum shear. However, the Mishnah Berurah says, Mikol makom, nachon lochush l'divrei gaonim. Gaonim said, shesoivin l'chatchila lo yaser son katanim etzboim al etzboim. So the source of the etzboim, the 2 by 2 finger breadths, is from the Gaonic period, who said they shouldn't make it smaller than that. V'hainu im hatitura, that's even if with the base. V'ayin bo l'stomich shekosov, the im ein machzik im hatitura rak etzba letzba, that with the titura, it's only 1 by 1 finger breadth, afilu b'diavad pasul. V'chein pasuk b'sefer bir Mordechai. V'ayin b'sefer Eliyah Rapa, another major achron that the Mishnah always quotes, shalimid aleim schus. But he said it's okay. Mikol makom sayim, to call bal nefesh, right? The Mishnah Berurah always, when he talks about a bal nefesh, I mean somebody wants to be machbar himself. Yizar lasos atitur rachav bezetz boy. That the titur should be at least 2 by 2. Levad kolelu matzu meod beelu at tefillin aktanim sheparsh same gruos ad meod. Very small tefillin, their parshas are very inferior in quality. Mitzad dachak hamokim, because it's very small. Kasher ba'ini ra'iti arbe mehem. Kasher be'inai ra'iti arbe, because I've seen in my own eyes how terrible they are. Al ken hashomer nafsho yishmor mehem. Somebody who is careful with his life should be careful about small tefillin. Now, the requirement of being square. We saw above that the Gemara requires the tefillin to be fashioned in a square shape due to Allah Moshe Sinai. The Gemara in the next line attempts to support this ruling from a Mishnah, but rejects it. Tana, this is Menachos Lamed A, Amud Aleph. Tefillin merubas, Allah Moshe Sinai. Tefillin have to be square. Rav Papa, the tafron uvelach soina means along their seam, and their diagonal has to be a perfect square, where they're sewn to the titorah. Ema Messiah, let us say that the following is support to that. Oisa tefillah, so agula, person makes round tefillin. Sakana, the ein ba mitzvah. It's a sakana, and he doesn't fulfill the mitzvah. Amr Papa masnisa Davida ki amguza. That's not a Messiah to our din, because the Mishnah is referring, that statement is referring where the tefillin were made like a nut, where the bottom was rounded. And thus, if he hit his head on the wall, it could injure him. But we could think that as long as the bottom part of the tefillin is flat, maybe it would be kosher, even though it's not square. So we needed the Baraisa to tell me that it's got to be square. That's how Rashi learned. Tefillin merubas b'toifon. B'tfirosan yishmor es rivon. When you sew it, you got to be careful to keep it square. Shlo yimshach chut atfir. But if you pull one of the threads too tight, it's going to sort of squash it. The Yitzhak is going to make its width less than the other side. Uva alach soinen, and the diagonal. The diagonal should be the same, like a perfect right angle triangle. Unless it's a perfect square, the diagonal won't be perfect. It would be invalid if even the corners are not square. What about tfilaso agula? Beis Moshe of tefillin ogul shelem beis Moshe v'lekamin doifin beitza. Let's say it looked like an egg. Sakana kashichanes bepesach. If he walks in to a door wearing those tefillin v'yaker rosho b'skufa, and he hits the tefillin on the lintel, shlo yichatzenu tefillin b'rosho. It'll go into his head. But mitzvah d'mubros alamoch l'mashinai. According to Halacha Mashinai, the bati must be square along the stitches at the edge, and if they were partially round, they are puzzled. The Mishnah discusses a different case of danger when one makes it tefillin entirely round like a nut. In this case, at least according to Rashi, the danger is a technical one that perhaps due to striking his head, the tefillin will injure him. Tosfos, though, has a different understanding of sakana. It explains the danger that the mitzvah will not protect the person, seemingly because one does not fulfill the mitzvah with round tefillin. Says Rabbeinu Tam, B'shas sakana yachol yistakin ben, he might become in danger if we're talking about a mitzvah. And he does not. We're talking about in a time when people would wear tefillin a whole day. He's not going to have the tefillin to protect him. Lo yasel neis kamol Elisha ba'al knafayim. Famous case in the Gemara, Elisha ba'al knafayim, in the time that the Romans issued an edict that you couldn't wear tefillin on pain of your life, and Elisha ba'al knafayim was wearing tefillin. A Roman officer ran after him, and Elisha ba'al knafayim quickly took the tefillin, put him in his hands like this. And the Roman general said to him, "What do you have in your hands?" He said, "I have the wings of a dove." Wings of a bird, he said. And he opened his hands and it was wings. So that's why he was called Elisha ba'al knafayim, because the tefillin miraculously saved him from being exposed as somebody wearing tefillin. Now, what about tefillin that lost their square shape? If the bottom of the tefillin was fashioned properly, but over time they lost their square shape. The Beis Yosef cites the Marami Rottenberg, right? The Marami Rottenberg lived in Worms. He died like 1290. He's the one that was ransomed. His body, he didn't want to be ransomed. He was kidnapped by the king. He told the Jewish community not to pay money. Eventually, after his death, a rich man ransomed his body, and they're buried together in the cemetery in Worms. And my wife and my mother and I and my sister, when we visited Frankfurt, we visited Worms and we saw we saw Marami Rottenberg's kever, and the person who's next to him, they're both covered in massive amounts of candles. So the person who ran the Marami Rottenberg is also honored because of that. In the same place is this shul, or the yeshiva where Rashi learned in Worms. Rashi was born in France, but went to Worms. That's where the great Chachamim were. So he studied in Worms, in the yeshiva there, and then went back to France. And there's a chair called Rashi's chair that you can sit in, which is the Rashi has sat in. It's built in the wall. I have a picture of that there. So I encourage everyone, if you ever visit that area, it's a wonderful place to visit. And you can see the Marami Rottenberg. The Marami Rottenberg is one of the major poskim for Ashkenazi Jews. The Beis Yosef will quote him many times, but many times if the Beis Yosef, let's say, poskins like the Rambam and the Rif, and the Ramah argues, the Ramah sometimes, if you look in the Darkei Moshe, will say, we'll have a source from either the Maharil or the Marami Rottenberg. They are the major Rishonim for Ashkenazic Jews that the Ramah relies on. So the Beis Yosef cites the Marami Rottenberg. Motzati b'tshuva Ashkenazis, notice he refers to a tshuva that comes from the German lands. That regarding the tzitzis, that if some of the threads were detached, so that even you don't have a minimum shear remaining on the corner, kosher. That's dainu dafka b'tzitzis. Yichsi vasulem tzitzis kloimar b'shas asiyat dafka kapid kro. The Torah wanted you when you made the tzitzis that it had to be kosher. If later on something happened to them, it still remains kosher. But that's not the same case with tefillin. If a tefillin merubas aloch l'mashmin Sinai, it's got to remain that way. Kol shaita be'inan shiyam merubas. It's not just a matter that at the time you made it, it had to be square, but that later on, if it somehow deforms into a non-square form, it remains good. Tefillin has the din that has to remain square. According to Rami Rattenberg, the tefillin must remain square, meaning that the requirement pertains to the shape of the tefillin rather than to when they were formed. And Rav Yosef Karo cites this opinion in the Shulchan Aruch as a yesh mi she'omer, right? Asam merubas v'achar zman niskalkel revuan. If you made them square, later on they're not, yesh mi she'omer shetzarach l'ravon. There is someone who says that you have to square them. He's referring to the Marami Rottenberg. Now, what is the definition of the tefillin losing their square shape? Does this disqualification include where the corners slightly become rounded? So my corners are perfectly square, but I guess you could have soft leather tefillin that if you look at them, maybe they become rounded. Or is it limited to where the shape of the entire bayit is no longer square? Like the bayit itself. He's talked about the corners. According to Mishnah Berurah, even the corners must remain square. If the batim are bent, one is facing east, one is facing west, or they're not a sharp corner. Achinasaogul becomes a little rounded. Or atfira. The base has been destroyed, or the sewing is destroyed. Acha of the rivon, so that the square shape is lost. All of these are examples where you'd have to correct it. So the Mishnah Berurah suggests two explanations for the case where the square shape has been lost. The batim are crooked, such that each is bent in the opposite direction, and the overall appearance is of a pentagon, or the edges of the batim become rounded, meaning that they get worn out slightly, so that they are no longer completely straight and sharp. On the other hand, the Aruch HaShulchan argues that the slight rounding of the corners does not disqualify the entire tefillin. He argues that this always occurs naturally over time, and the halacha does not require them to remain perfectly square forever. Uman nikra kilkul haribua. What is considered a disqualification regarding square? Nearly, says the Aruch HaShulchan, They became squashed a little bit length or width. Or or they're missing something. The Yeshirotzim Loimar, when the corners, the skaklu tzatz b'chidudu, they're not as sharp. The Mexico looks a little rounded. Mikri kilko. However, ulalnias daiti lo nirakain. The Aruch HaShulchan says, I'm not machmer so much. Chada, sharibu lo niskalkim, the square basic shape has not been changed. If the sharpness is removed equally on the length and the width, it's going to remain square. That's going to end up round. It's not round. They remain square. Just because the corners are not as sharp, it's not that they've lost a square shape. So says the Aruch HaShulchan, that it's got to remain square in the diagonal. It's got to have 4 equal corners. The corners have to be equal in location. If the corners become slightly rounded, we call malcolm hazivus shavus hein. We have the ode. The lo nitna Torah l'malach hasharis. Torah wasn't given to angels. The kilkul azavisi be'echrech. Your corners are going to get rounded. The emet ki yesh soifrim mumchim gedolim bum nosim bebatim shlo yiskalklu. Even though there are expert soifrim who make batim that don't get ruined, aval ruba de ruba ein b'yichalosim lasus ken. The majority of soifrim can't do that. The people that make these kind of tefillin that are sort of damage proof take a huge amount of money. Average people can't afford it. Even those expert ones, if you look at them carefully, they might have a little kilkel as well. It happens through natural erosion. The Chalil Loimer al Shem Psul. Kodesh Baruch Hu doesn't come to his creations with complaints like this. Make it to the best you can.
I would suggest humbly that here you see the difference between a shul rav, a Rava community with the Aruch HaShulchan, and a tzaddik Talmid Chacham at the Mishnah Berurah who wasn't the Rava community. The Aruch HaShulchan talks about how much it costs. It's very expensive, and you don't see that in the Mishnah Berurah.
Absolutely. By the way, the Aruch HaShulchan was probably the major posek in America, but that people used the Aruch HaShulchan a lot. But it changed. I would say that, like the Lakewood, my Rebbe in the 1960s in Hillel Hebrew Academy, that we already started learning Mishnah Berurah, in 5th and 6th grade, how to learn it. It became, I think, when the yeshiva world recreated the yeshiva Lakewood, and of course the influence of the Lakewood Rabbanim in all the various schools, like Yaakov said, they wanted to follow a posek who was more of a Rosh Yeshiva.
It's interesting. I actually just read an article about it, and one of the reasons they said that the Mishnah Berurah has sort of come into the ascendancy of the Aruch HaShulchan, which before was number one, is Rav Aaron Kotler Zatzal always walked around with a Mishnah Berurah. Wherever he went, he walked around with the Mishnah Berurah, and he went to a lot of places, so people noticed that.
Right.
That was one of the major reasons cited for the popularity now.
Right. And I was just saying, I figured also it had to do with the Lakewood, because the Torah Masorah schools were populated a lot by Rabbanim from Lakewood at that time, certainly by the 60s and 70s. Rambam was, we had Rabbi Gruman was a Talmid of Rav Aaron Kotler, etc. So that influence definitely was very felt in Los Angeles.
Ernie, just a practical question. How do squared bottom become rounded? Do they become wet? If the leather becomes wet, does it soften and it rounds it out? Or is there some other process that...
Through use, people who drop it, people who bag it on the table. We're talking about these corners here.
Yeah.
These corners. So, my tefillin are very hard, but I've had other tefillin sometimes that are softer. It has to do with the qualities. where it's not a matter of soft, but softer.
Is this your only tefillin?
No.
Mm.
I had it when I was bar mitzvah, and I had another pair of tefillin, and
Yeah, but leather that's subjected to water, over time should soften and lose its shape.
so in a let's say somebody was walking around in the rain with his tefillin,
Right.
Sweat a lot.
or they were sweating.
Sweaters.
Look, the Aruch HaShulchan himself said that he's seen even expertly made tefillin that after chronic use, they're mekalkalim ma'at. As Yaakov said, he was a Rav in shul, practical person. So according to the Aruch HaShulchan, the second explanation of Mishnah Berurah that the edges or corners are no longer sharp is incorrect. Although the corners may be slightly round, the overall square shape of the tefillin remains intact. In such a case, the tefillin is still kosher according to the Aruch HaShulchan. Since the Rambam's understanding the diagonal being straight in the Gemara is that the corners are straight. Number two, the wearing out of the corners are impossible to prevent. The Torah wasn't given to angels, therefore it must not be possible. Piskei Tshuvas adopts a middle approach, that lechatchila one should try to repair the corners if they have lost their sharp edge. But b'diavad, one can be lenient. He's more stringent when the corner actually becomes somewhat more rounded. And the Yaakov Yosef takes a similar approach. Hashe'elot binyan zeh mitzuyos ma'od. These shilas are very common. The Bir Halacha, of course, was the Mishnah Berurah. Pigimos, damage or blitos, where it's bumped on the corners, shalatitura. It's not just the bias, but it's the titura as well. Remember the bottom part, that's the titura. If it's 1 millimeter, the size of a fingernail, you have to be repaired. But you have it kosher libracha. But you have it, you can make a bracha on it. Kosher niskakel tzurus, as long as it still looks square. Nifkam bechud zavis habayis lamala. Now we're talking about the corners of the bayis. Vanasaki eagle becomes a little rounded. Yesh yoiser lahak pir l'staken. Here you should fix it. Akam b'zeh yesh lis kosher lo nit netor lamalach hasharis. The corners are going to become damaged. You don't have to correct it right away. Where you don't make a bracha, as long as it's just minor. So you see the Piskei Tshuvas is bringing, they're waffling. He's really walking a fine line between the two, Mishnah Berurah and the Aruch HaShulchan here. Okay. Let's go to 275, halachos of the Ritzuos. We learned towards the beginning of the Shir that the Ritzuos must be black. It's also halach l'Moshe Messinai. The Gemara Menachos elaborates that the requirement to be black applies only to the outer side of the Ritzuos, not to the inner. On Rav Yitzchak Ritzuos Shcharis halach l'Moshe Messinai. Has to be black. Meisvei tefillin ein kosher neson ela b'mina. The straps have to be the same of the hide, the same type of hide as the bayis. Ben yerokos, ben shchoros, ben levonis. It has to be from the hide, whether it's green, black, or white. But adumos lo yasim negnai v'davar acher. It shouldn't be red, because people will think you're engaged in some kind of sexual thing with a woman who's in nida, and you're getting blood on the straps. So, how can you say ritzur shchoirois? Here they're talking about shchurois, yerukois, and levonois. So Gemara says loy kasha, kan b'bifnim, kan b'bachutz. The ritzus on the outside have to be black, but on the inside it doesn't even b'bifnim. My gnai v'davar acher. It can zim into mitzaf chesen lay. What's the gnai? Because sometimes the straps become reversed, and then the fact that it's not black is going to be seen, and especially if they're red, people are going to suspect you maybe of an unusual practice. The Rambam rules, with the answer to the Gemara, that the outside of the ritzuos must be black, but not the inner side. Rambam Hilchos Tefillin, Haritzu shel Tefillin, ben shel rosh, ben shel yad, pnei ha'machitzonim shchorim. The outer surface has to be black. Zalach l'Moshe Messinai. Aval ha'achrei ritzuos, the back of the straps, hoil mifnim, hain, since they're on the inside, ha'yirukos levonos ksheros. If they're green or white, it's okay. Adumos lo yas, Hashem etapech ritzus gnayu lo. It might be embarrassing because they might suspect him. V'lo yachrei haritzur lo'olam ela ke'ein hatzitza. The strap should be the same as the color of your bias. Im yeruka yeruka, vim levana levana. V'noyelet tefillin shekulan shcharis hatzitza v'ritzur kula. But the tefillin should be entirely black, the compartments and the whole strap. The Rambam writes in this quote that the batim may be colors other than black, because he says if you're the back of the things don't have to be black, but they could be green or white, like the color of your batim. So the Rambam seemed to imply that the colors of your batim could be other colors. By the way, we know that there are cows. You see white cows, and you see. I've never seen a green cow. I've seen red cows, reddish cows. So, other Rishonim, such as Tosfos and the Rosh, disagree, as the Gemara does not discuss the color of the batim. In their opinion, the batim as well must be black. The Tosfos Shabbos Kaf Ches Amud Beis Tefillin, Ritzu Shchoros Halach L'Moshe Messiah. The straps have to be black according to halacha. Kiva the Matzrach Shiar Ritzu Shchoros come on tzitza, just like the bias. Kol shekein the Binin Shiur Toharos come on tzitza. They have to be from a kosher animal like the box as well. The Shulchan Aruch paskins that both the outer side of the Ritzus and the bati must be covered black. Halachos Rishina Shiur Ritzu Shchoros M'Bachutz. Aval Mitzad Mipnim Yasem Ezet Sever Shiur. So the inside could be any color. Chutz Me'adom except for red. Shema Yomer should be dam chatatov nitzbu vadimov. That people say became you're bleeding from wounds or the other source of blood. That's in Lamed Gimel, and in Lamed Beis it says, or abati mitzvah laso is shachor. The leather of the batim also have to be black. The Mishnah Berurah cites some poskim or more machmir concerning the color of the batim. Mitzvah. The fact that it said mitzvah laso is shachor implies that it's only mitzvah and amuvchor, but that you could also make another color. Mashma de b'diavad eno liikuva. That making a green tefillin box is not usher. It's not ma'akev. However, yesh poshkim disfrilu do alach l'mashinei kamar ritzus liikuva u'afilu b'diavad. That just like the ritzus have to be black, and if it wasn't black, it would be ma'akev. By the batim, it's the same thing. Ubebir agra mashma shu mitzadik kain la'alocha. The bir gra seems to imply that that's the halacha, that the batim have to be black, even b'diavad. V'chein b'shuas Yaakov, v'chein mashma b'eliyah Rabba, u'shar knes agdoila, v'yesh lachmir. Yimlo b'mokum d'lo yefshar. If you're in a place where there's no other alternative. But if you're in a place where there's no alternative, yesh lismoch adivra makilim k'tei shelo yisbatal mitzvahs tefillin. Since there are mekilim that the colors of the bias of the tefillin doesn't have to be black, there are and you have no other choice, you could use the tefillin. We should note that according to the Rambam cited above, the batim need not necessarily be black, but the color of the batim must be the same as that of the inner side of the ritzuos, which is more stringent than the other opinions, who do not require that the bias and the inner side of the ritzuos have to be the same color. Thus, according to the Rambam, if the batim are black, the inner side of the ritzuos must also be black. Although the Shulchan Aruch and Mishnah do not accept this stringency as an obligation, it's mentioned in the readings of the Arizal, known as the Shar Kavonis. Sharach she'ashchirim ponim va'achar shcharis ko'erev. You must color them black as a raven on the inner side and the outer side. The Ben Ish Chai wrote in the 1800s, was the Sephardic posek, right, that in Iraq, it was not customary to color the inside of the ritzuos black. The pious ones in Jerusalem also did not have one unified custom. Afagav dal piasod, through Kabbalah, mashchin ritzuos pnim v'achor shcharis ko'erev. The outside, the innards of the straps should be black. Kiniska b'shar kavonos Rabbeinu Arizal, like it's mentioned, like we just read. Lo na'agadnu mekach. We didn't. That was not our minig. B'shalti aminach chasidi b'rak kodesh. We asked about Yerushalayim. V'amruli sheyesh nizram lashker ponim v'achor v'yeshein medakting bo. So the Shevet HaLevi, Rav Vosner, rules that individuals who wish to color their ritzuos black on the inner side as well are permitted to do so. But this should not be practiced in public, since the major poskim have not been concerned with this stringency. G'dali Yisrael Posket Adoros Lo Choshu La'anig Afilu L'noi Ba'almo. Even for beauty, they weren't choishes to do this. Vada Halam Tan must have had a reason. Madulo Inigu came to Dover Kalkazeh. Im came Lamalan Lashanas Pnealach. Why should we change minogim? Im Yechidim Inagu came Tavolam Brocha. If they want to do this minig privately, fine. Avalanik derech lo'iro lo yisid tzorech. But to paskin this way publicly, I don't think there's a need. V'anach lam Yisrael kibnei nevi'im. We should let the Klal Yisrael do the way they're doing.
Well, last year I went to buy a pair of tefillin for my grandson. And for the first time I ever saw this, the sofer said to me, "You want ritzuas that are black on both sides?" And I'd never even heard of it. And he said, "This is the rage today. This is what all the bar mitzvah boys are getting. So do you want it black on both sides?" I took black on one side. But anyway, I never had seen this before.
Here you
So,
go. So
yeah.
you see, Rav Wosner says there's no need for it.
Yeah.
So it's a craze. It's a fad.
Said it's the style today.
Does we talk about the ink itself, where it derived from, what
We
kind
will.
of?
We will.
Okay,
You know,
okay.
that's going to cut the parchment, the
Yeah.
dinim of the parchment, the dinim of the ink. It's all coming.
Also a
Jacob.
practical advice. If you go to the Swarm store where you buy the tefillin, they will sell you something like a stencil with kosher ink in it to touch up, let's say, a corner or anywhere there's something rubbed off and you want to make it perfectly square. You can do your own job, and I assume you have to say Shem Mitzvah tefillin or some Kedushas tefillin, something like that. And the ink is kosher ink, and I have it in my towels bag, just like an extra wheel.
Nice.
Rav Moshe said, and I'm just saying that I don't know if everyone accepts this halacha, but Rav Moshe said it, that if you want to blacken your tefillin, you can actually use shoe polish as long as it's a new bottle and you designate it and you don't ever use it for anything else other than the tefillin, that you didn't have to do it. So that was Rav Moshe's point of view. That's what I.
Wow.
Right, because the laws of what kind of ink you need to write on parchment, it's not that the black has to be black. It doesn't say our black tefillin doesn't have to be black with dio. So I understand what Rav Moshe is saying. It has to be black.
Yeah.
Okay, gentlemen, yasher koyach. I think it's a wonderful introduction to tefillin. Any other comments or issues?
Shkoyach,
All the
really
ones
a
that
lot.
were, all the
Very
ones that
good.
were, the ones that were
Beautiful.
raised were spot on.
Beautiful.
And
Thank you.
welcome Yaakov Goldfinger.
Koyach.
Yeah. Hey, great.
Good
Yeah,
night.
Ernie.
Everyone, be well. Thank
Have a
you.
wonderful
Thank you.
week, everybody.